Hello, and welcome to Bad Bleeps of the Bible. So again, welcome to the beginning, the inaugural episode of Bad Bleeps of the Bible. My name is Scott, and before we get into the meat of the episode, because this is the initial episode, I wanted to go over a little bit about what this podcast is, what it's not specifically, who I am, and why I have the absolute gall to start a podcast based on the Bible, where this name came from, and what you can expect to see from these episodes. So first, what is this podcast? At its heart, this is a storytelling podcast where we look at obscure and not so obscure characters from the Bible and tell their story. There are so many tales of incredible characters of the Bible whose stories never get told. And if they are told, they're used only as, cautionary tales to spook the listeners into, I'm going to put this in strong air quotes, good behavior. This podcast really is meant to kind of turn that narrative around and on its head. We're going to take those rarely told stories and we're going to make them fun. We're going to make them fascinating, non-judgmental, and huge, bold caps, whatever, not religious. And that last point is what this podcast really is not. It's not going to be a morality podcast. This is not going to be a morality tale. It's not meant to teach you anything, really. And it's not affiliated with any religion, spiritual practice, nothing. We're just going to have a good time hearing an interesting and most of the time weird story. That being said, we may get into some background information, kind of the where and how, but we're never going to really get into the deep meanings of the story. So trust and believe that it's going to be really chill. Who am I and why am I here? Well, first, again, my name is Scott, and I'm what they call a PK. And in Jesus speak, that is a pastor's kid, PK. There are also MKs, missionaries kid, EKs, I think, evangelist kids. I think that's it. But if you know anything about pastor's kids, we are both notorious and infamous. Again, so why am I here? Well, my dad is a pastor, but not just a pastor. He was an independent, fundamental, Southern, Bible-believing Baptist who established a church in our town and spoke there, preached there for 40 years, and just recently retired. And again, this is the hardcore Baptist, so skirts only, no cable growing up, no movies, definitely no Harry Potter. And we went to church twice on Sunday and then once on Wednesday, so a lot of church growing up. I was also, I'm going to put forced, sorry, Mom, if you're listening, but I was also attended Christian, air quotes again, school from the time I was in kindergarten to senior year, where I was salutatorian and homecoming king, I just have to say. So stories of the Bible touched every part of my day. I had Bible class. We always had readings from the Bible. Papers that we wrote were written about Bible stories. We looked at history through the lens of the Bible. We had chapel every Friday with more narratives about the Bible. It was Bible, Bible, Bible. I grew up in the church, clearly, and with these stories, but as soon as I turned 18, I swiftly grew out of the church. I expanded my thinking and ran as far from the church as I possibly could. But I guess in my running, though, what I found was that these stories truly never left me. And while I was able to run away from the church, the stories kind of stuck around with me. So now here I am, a non-religious 30-something homosexual who has a wealth of Bible knowledge from years of being taught it and no one to share it with. So what do you do with all this information? What do you do with all those stories? Again, you share it. Hence this podcast. Where the name came from, I'm going to keep this really brief since I've already rambled on for almost 5 minutes now. But initially it was meant to be bad babes of the Bible. Insert another word for babe that is not as friendly. Hence the bleep. But that didn't work because I also wanted to talk about some obscure dudes of the Bible. Maybe it's some obscure animals, other things. Plus, I wanted to make sure this was at least somewhat kid friendly. So fast forward to some iterations and enter the bleep. And we're going to fill that bleep in with whatever we want. That could be babe, it could be boy, it could be brats, whatever. We're not limiting our horizons. So we're using the bleep. And what can you expect from this podcast? Well, at its heart, we're telling stories. So you can expect a short 10 to 20 minute story about an obscure yet fascinating person from the Bible. We're not going to label these folks good or bad. No, we're just going to tell their stories, and you can expect whatever you want out of that. You can get some morality out of it. You can give yourself the experience that you would like, but we're just telling the stories. And you can expect episodes on Tuesdays and Fridays. Fingers crossed that I can do the research. But it's fun and it's interesting. So you can expect most of the time episodes on Tuesdays and Fridays. All right, that's it. So we're done. The expedition has been exposed, and I promised you won't necessarily get this much of a prelude again. But I figured it was just good to establish my cred, establish why we're here, and all of that. So now, without any further ado, let's get into it. So today's Bible story comes from Judges 14 of the Old Testament. So if you're unfamiliar with how the Bible is set up, there are two testaments. The Old Testament, so think the beginning of time, Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, etc. Roughly around 200 BC to 2000 BC. So we're talking very, very old. And then there's the New Testament, which I would just label Jesus plus. Everything post-C, everything post the birth of Jesus, including Revelation telling the end of the world, the end times, all of that. But again, our Bible story comes from Judges, part of the Old Testament. And this story specifically comes from around 1107 BC. Now, Judges is a book in the Bible that lists the 12 folks that judged, again, air quotes, Israel during their oppressions, times when things were not going well in Israel, which is a lot, to be honest, during the Old Testament. And during this time, they need to fight out constantly to get out of the hard times. And I mentioned 12. 12 is one of those really cool numbers of the Bible. They use it a lot. For example, the 12 tribes of Israel, there were 12 disciples. Jesus started teaching when he was only 12 years old. So clearly, it's a really important number. So putting in the most basics of terms, these judges, these folks were military leaders who led Israel out of the turmoil and into peace. And the last thing you need to know before we start our journey and our story is that we are in the time of the judge Deborah, Israel's one and only woman judge. A fact in and of itself that I think is pretty cool. So that's it. That's our setting. That's where we're pulling this from. Old Testament, Book of Judges, and Deborah, the judge. Side note, if you have ever seen Addams Family Values, the Family's Truly movie, Deborah is chef's kiss. But anyway, getting back into it, now we're going to get into our story, a story that involves squeamish soldiers, 900 chariots of iron, warm milk, tent stakes, and one incredible bleep named Jael. Our story begins with things not going well at all in Israel. The people of Israel once again ticked off God by being evil, and as punishment, God decided that they should suffer. But not only mildly suffer, he wanted them to suffer for 20 years. This would be one of those oppressions that I mentioned earlier. And who exactly was oppressing them? Well, that would be Canaan, Israel's border buddy, and then their once future and honestly long-term enemy. Canaan is always annoying Israel. So seriously, they always had the most beef with Canaan. Regardless, the leader of the Canaanite army and meanie number one was a dude named Sisera. Remember that name? If you want to, as I just did, put it in the context of Chicago the musical, feel free. So we have Sisera. Sisera is clutch in this story. He's public enemy number one. And just as a fun fact, the Bible makes sure to point out that Sisera was able to oppress the Israelites because of his 900 chariots of iron. The Bible decided that they definitely needed to be mentioned, these 900 chariots of iron. A lot of chariots, a lot of iron, a lot of horses, a lot of oppression. So that's our context. Enter Miss Deborah, our one and only female judge and military leader. we can find her sitting under a beautiful palm tree. Literally, the Bible mentions that she's sitting under a palm tree. She's sitting there, looking around, deciding that finally, enough was enough. She's been told by the high and mighty that it was time for Israel to fight back against this oppression. So she calls up Israel's captain and says, and I'm going to paraphrase here, it's time for Canaan to get wrecked and yeet themselves out of Israel. The military captain, again, this has been 20 plus years that they've been oppressed, is at first like, sure, Deborah, yeah, that's what we're going to do. Wink, wink. And balks at her command. Deborah, being the fierce baddie that she is, gives no cares and says, because of this balking, fine. Because you said you were so scared and didn't want to go along with the plan of me and the Lord, the honor of this victory isn't going to belong to you. It's going to go to a woman. Amazing. Direct quote from the Bible. The journey that thou takest shall not be for thine honor, for the Lord shall send Sisera into the hand of a woman. If I could, I would put the bombastic side eye meme here because So Deborah truly gives no cares, says we're going to do this regardless. We're going to fight off these oppressors. So after this tongue lashing from his boss, the military captain finally decides to fight back against the Canaanites. And this would be the point in the story where one of those fancy little tinkling bells would happen and we would pan forward. I'm not going to do that. What I am going to say is we need to cue a military fight, Braveheart style. Picture it with me. Blood everywhere, people screaming, the battle raging. And who's winning? Israel. For once, they are winning. And who sees that Israel is winning and decides to flee his people and his army like a scared person? That would be public enemy number one, Sisera. He sees that the fight is not going well. Israel's not supposed to do this. They're not supposed to fight back. And they were going to suffer clearly an inevitable victory. So he decides to cut his losses, becomes this brave person that he is, and abandons ship. He hops out of his chariot and runs away on foot, which, side note, I'm not sure if that was the move, truly. Why not just stay in the chariot and flee away? But I don't know, whatever. And then, friends, this is where it gets so good and so juicy. So Sisera has fled the scene and winds up at the tent of a Bedouin named Jael. He arrives pictured hot, bothered, sweaty, sandy, and just all around gross. And rather than turn him away, Jael, this Bedouin, says, "Hi, welcome. Hey, come in. I can really tell you've been through it. Come inside to my tent. Relax. Fear not. Here. No. Come in. Yeah, lay down. Let me get you a blanket." And Sisera does just that. He comes to this tent. He's welcomed. He goes inside and lays down to get tucked in by his amazing host, Jael. She even goes so far as to bring him warm milk and cover him up and make sure he's nice and comfy and ready to relax. So just to pause, we have to give Sisera a tiny bit of credit. Before he bundles up for the night, he does say to Jael, "Hey, listen, I don't know if you know this, but I'm really important. If you see people coming after me, and if you see them running after maybe an entire army coming after me, just tell them, no one's here. No one's in the corner sleeping. Just do that for me." And I'm just picturing Jael giving like a little wink and a thumbs up and then agreeing. And with that, Sisera falls asleep. And this next part is both terrifying, insane, and amazing. And I'm actually going to read it to you directly from the text. Then Jael took a nail of the tent and took a hammer in her hand and went softly unto him and smote the nail into his temples and fastened it into the ground. For he, Sisera, was fast asleep and weary. So he died. So just in case you missed it, Jael knew exactly who this fool was from the minute he eyeballed her tent to the minute she welcomed him in. And when he was good and comfortable and asleep, she got a tent stake. You can picture one of those long, pointy, long cylindrical stakes that you like nail tents into the ground with, one of those, and hammered that tent stake into Sisera's temples, both of them, nailing his head into the ground. We're going to take a quick pause for the sheer shock factor of this act by Jael. Okay, we've recovered, right? So now that Sisera is laying there, literally staked into place, who should come prancing along but Captain Useless of Israel's army? And when I tell you Jael was ready, she was ready. The text says that she welcomed the new captain and said, "Come, come, and I will show thee the man whom thou seekest." And when he came into her tent, behold, Sisera lay dead, and the nail was in his temples, which fulfilled Deborah's prophecy that the Lord would deliver Sisera not into the hands of the captain, but into the hands of a woman. So that's our story covering our, I guess, ingenious assassin Jael, whose story only covers six verses out of the 31,102 verses in the Bible, but whose story deserves to be told. So to close, later in the book of Judges, Deborah and the captain, the two of them, actually made up a little song about Jael that the Bible decided to include. And please don't picture anyone singing this song. I'm just literally going to read how it should be stated. Now, if you want to put a little song to it, feel free. But this is what they sang. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed of tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank. He fell. There he lay. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell. Dead. And that is our story today of one incredible bad bleep of the Bible, Jael. I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Please feel free to get in touch with me and share your thoughts at badbleepsofthebible@gmail.com, at Instagram at badbleepsofthebible. Sources for today's story can be found in our show notes, and please rate, review, and subscribe. My goal is to read each and every review just for my own sake and to improve this podcast. Thank you so much. Catch you next time, and watch out for tent stakes. Bye.